Hello and welcome to week 4. This week we continue with works that are written in the dialogic presentation and hope we get into something really fun here, gender and education in the Renaissance, and how should men and women be educated. And we think this is a really fun topic and have been talking about it a lot before we've made this recording, so we hope to bring you into the fun of the discussion as well.
And this was a very hot topic during the Renaissance. I mean, the roles of men and women are always a hot topic, but especially in this time period when education was taking on new importance, right? You have the rediscovery of all these classical texts. You have lots of people that are trying to renew the glories of ancient Greece and Rome, and one of the most important ways to do that is through education. So you have this whole group of people called the humanists who want to revive classical education, and so in doing that, they have some tough questions to try to deal with about who should receive that education and how that education should fit into the social structure that's already set up. So the text, one of the texts that we are looking at, and we are looking at only a very small piece of each of these three texts. Please keep in mind that all three of these books, Castiglione is the Book of the Courtier, Bruto's Education of a Young Noblewoman, and Christine de Pisan's City of Ladies, are all much larger, longer books. We are just taking a tiny, tiny slice of them. So please don't feel like you understand them all from this, because there's so much more, and if you're interested, there's so much more. So Castiglione's book, The Courtier, as your head note to the reading tells you, was published in the early 1520s, well, in the 1520s, 1528. And it was supposedly the record of a conversation that he had been part of or had witnessed at a court, at a royal court back in Urbino, back when he was a diplomat. And so we don't really know how much of this is made up or how much of this is actually true to what really happens, but I don't think it really matters, actually, because he captures these questions about courtly life in the Renaissance, and specifically about how to make it. So in some ways this is like a political book for aspiring government workers or aspiring presidents. How do you become a perfect politician?
Aspiring philosopher kings.
As it were, yes. And so Castiglione's Book of the Courtier was very, very famous during its own time. Lots and lots of people read it as a sort of success manual. How do I make it? How do I become successful during this time? And so the setup of this book is that a bunch of courtly ladies and gentlemen are hanging out together at a court in Urbino, and they're trying to figure out how to pass the time one evening. And so they come up with all of these ideas of what we might do, what kind of party games we might play, and they say, maybe we should have everybody tell jokes, and they said, no, that doesn't sound so fun. Maybe we should talk about this. No, that doesn't sound so fun. And somebody says, hey, I have an idea. Why don't we talk about what we think the perfect courtier, the perfect courtly gentleman would be like? And everybody says, that sounds like a great idea. We'll all take turns. And so it's very, very much not just a dialogue, because there's more than two people talking. It's very much a conversation in which tons of different ideas are floated out. But several of them, the ones that we are giving to you in this handout, seem to recur over and over, or at least the conversation seems to agree on some of these things, and specifically the ones that we've given you.
And I guess it's my turn to talk now.
I've got
What
to
I
breathe.
think, what I think is important to remember is that we are talking about people living a political life here. So a very particular class of society. They're not talking about education in general for men and for women, but education for the noble elite of society whose job it is to lead the country or to lead the kingdom.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we would even have to say that, because for most of human history, that's the only people that were educated. Those were the only people who were educated anyway. So, I mean, they don't feel the need to say, this. We're not talking about the lower classes here, because the lower classes just weren't educated. But even their discussion is not so much about formal education as it is about it's about learning objectives, about the skills and knowledge that someone would need to develop in order to have a successful career, specifically a successful career in the courts and governments of Renaissance Italy. And so we have, in the handout that you have in the reading, there are lots of different skills. We could make a whole list of the different skills that he thinks that a courtier should have, all the way from his ability to use weapons, to painting, to writing, to speaking, to dancing, to music, that there's quite a list of general education requirements. But the part that I would like to focus on or draw your attention to is at the bottom of page 1, which talks about the method of education, the way that this courtier gains his education. And it says, therefore, he who wishes to be a good pupil, besides performing his tasks well, must put forth every effort to resemble his master, and if it were possible, to transform himself into his master. And when he feels that he has made some progress, it will be very profitable to observe different men of the same calling, and governing himself with that good judgment which must ever be his guide, to go about selecting now this thing from one and that thing from another. And so this process of education is not formal schooling in the sense of sitting down in a classroom and having someone teach you these things, so much as it is finding people who know how to do what you want to do, and watching them, imitating them, looking at a bunch of different people and learning from a variety of teachers to cobble together the skills that are going to be most necessary for your situation.
So, these are social skills too, which I think are learned by imitation. Think about high school. When you were a freshman, yes. Well, any social situation, but what came to my mind is you were just talking about that is a social hierarchy where you come in, okay, let's say you're a freshman in high school and you're kind of geeky and don't really know what to do, and you see the big cool seniors and what they're doing. I think this is something very important that humans do well. We watch, we see what somebody is doing, we try on these personas. How many different ways did you try to act or dress or be when you were an adolescent, right? We're glad we don't have pictures with us now. But those are the things that people do to try to rise in the social hierarchy, and that's exactly what's being taught here, rising in the social hierarchy within this particular political class.
And it reminds me of Menand's second theory,
yes,
about those intangible skills that you learned during college that you might not learn anywhere else. And when I think about as a teacher, how often the things that my students learn from me go way beyond content knowledge to how to manage their time, how to write an email to a teacher that isn't insulting, how to ask for help when necessary, how to work as a team, all these kinds of things that go beyond learning calculus or learning, American history.
Right. We don't see the same sorts of discussion and I want to say justification for the subject matter here in the Renaissance that we saw Socrates spelling out to Glaucon in the Republic.
Right.
There's certainly some similarities, and I think it's fascinating to do a little comparing and contrasting between what Plato was presenting his ruling class in an ideal world would be taught, and what Castiglione here is presenting the ideal ruling class be taught.
Yeah, because there's a lot in common.
Mm-hmm.
And Castiglione and his cronies here had certainly read Plato. I mean, there was a big resurgence of Plato during this time. But it is interesting that there isn't that same sort of, practical application of all of these things. I mean, you do have to learn how to use weapons because you might duel. I guess that's kind of practical.
Yes, you need to know how to defend yourself with both a rapier, a dagger, and a pistol.
One other thing that I want to point out is at the top of page 2, one of the most famous parts of this particular discussion is Castiglione's emphasis on doing things naturally, doing things with a sort of, he calls it nonchalance, and the Italian word that he uses is a new word. It's called sprezzatura. I love that word, sprezzatura, and it means doing things as if they were easy or making them look easy. And I think about how we value that in our own society still, that when we watch Olympic athletes or when we watch ballet dancers or singers, that we want to think that it happens very naturally, that we don't want to see the evidence of all the hard work. When someone makes a mistake, no, that's not supposed to happen. It's supposed to be effortless somehow.
Right, effortless, natural. Although, we still value the hard work that's put in. We don't want it to look that way.
Mm-hmm.
Think, for example, how upset people were when, you learn somebody's been lip syncing.
Yes.
If we want to go back to my childhood, when I learned that Donnie and Marie lip synced.
What?
Yes.
I was
in the
thinking Milli
variety
Vanilli.
show. Okay, Milli Vanilli, and more recently the the orchestra that played during the presidential inauguration, the most Obama's presidential inauguration, it was so cold, their instruments literally would not stay in tune. And anyone who knows the fine instruments knows that. But the people were just outraged that they were playing along and faking it to a recording.
Right.
Because we want things to be natural. These are talented musicians. They should be able to play without, regardless of the weather.
Right. And I think about, even in school now, I have a 4th grade son, and it is not enough that he know the times tables. He has to be able to do them very quickly.
Ah, yes.
And so, surely that has practical application, but, the ACT test, SAT test, it's not that just that you can get the answer, you have to be able to do it quickly. This has to be something natural, innate to you. It can't take too much work on your part, or it doesn't have the same kind of value for our society, which I think is very interesting.
And we could talk about this for a lot longer, but we'd better move on.
So hopefully you'll get a chance to read this very carefully, to look at the things that he requires of his courtier, or that the conversationalist, I guess not Castiglione necessarily, asks for them to do. One of the things that Steph and I were talking about before we started this video was the fact that he isn't learning law, he's not learning medicine, he's not learning accounting, he's not learning any of the trades, I guess, that have become prestigious in our own time when you talk about someone's education. He doesn't seem to be training for any kind of career at all, although the men in this conversation did go on to become really important people in Italian politics, Italian church leadership. And so this is a broad-based liberal education in many ways.
For the leaders who aren't going to make a living. Their living is taken care of for them, so they don't have to worry about that.
Their living is taken care of for them as long as they can continue to please the right people.
Oh, that's right, as long as they are in favor.
Yes.
That's right. So, did you say this already, that we're talking about the second tier?
I didn't say this.
We're talking about the people who have to please, and this is mentioned, you must please your master, you must please your mistress. And that's not in terms of one as a servant, but that they are courtiers who are loyal to the ruler, right?
Yeah, who are trying to move into those positions of power, and most of these guys eventually do, and women eventually do. But right now they are in a place where they have to impress the right people. They have to balance their desire to be reformers, of course, at the same time that they have to kind of, kowtow to the people in charge. And so they're walking a very fine line, just as most people entering a new career are. When you come in and you say, I've got a college education and your company is doing everything wrong and I'm going to fix it, you're not going to last very long probably. So those people, the soft skills that are so important. So, I guess although the specific job training is missing, the focus on effective communication, things we've been talking about in class, are there.
For your career as a politician.
Yeah. All right, and so then in Castiglione's book of the Courtier, it's actually separated into 4 separate books. The first 2 books talk about the courtly gentleman, and the 3rd book talks about the courtly lady, and you have some passages about that here.
And so one of my favorites, because I just love to take varying views on what the gender roles are, as I read through this on page 4, after we've gone through how women in many ways should have a similar education to men, but they need to be dainty, they need to be very unlike a man physically, they need to always be sweet and soft, and must above all be beautiful.
Right.
Because if you're not beautiful, you've pretty much lost all your credibility. Is this paragraph on page 4 that starts with the brackets, the court lady, saying that she must have not only the good sense to discern the quality of him with whom she is speaking, but knowledge of many things in order to entertain him graciously. And in her talk she should come to know how to choose those things that are adapted to the quality of him with whom she is speaking, and should be cautious lest occasionally, without intending it, she utter words that may offend him. And it goes on. And so my first reaction as someone who teaches freshman writing is, oh, well, she has to know her audience.
Yes.
She's supposed to know how to speak to this man, but then she must please him. And I'm like, oh, I've put up with having to listen to enough bores in my life that at this point I'm thinking, oh, really? But then as we were talking here over lunch, we realized that we're talking about someone who must play the role of a diplomat. She is a hostess. She's at in court where there are probably people with a lot of competing interests. There are men who may break into a duel with their various weapons with which they're skilled to use. But she has to find a way to maintain the peace, maintain the conversation, maintain the facade of the social gathering, whatever's going on at that time. And so this is a really important skill. And we made a joke about, well, you know, how many times does Hillary Clinton have to do this as the Secretary of State? Does she have to put up with someone that she doesn't really want to talk nicely to, but she does? And I think see this in diplomatic circles as an important skill for maintaining the peace.
Yeah, and in fact, during the Renaissance, often educated women were used as in this diplomatic role. For instance, at one point, the King of France came to Venice to visit, and they found one of the educated ladies of the town and brought her to talk with him as proof of their civilization in
wow.
Venice, as proof of that they were worthy of being allies. And I think it's especially interesting that they would choose a woman for a role like that, because of these exact skills that Castiglione is talking about here. Knowing how to talk to the person in the right terms. I mean, these are networking skills.
Oh, yeah.
And this
Very
is
much.
still essential, and that makes me think, well, where's the class? Where do we learn this
Yeah.
in school? I'm not sure.
Do we learn that in communications?
Perhaps.
It is an oral communication
Yes.
skill, though, so perhaps
Right.
UF 100 is the place for it now.
At least we can
I don't know.
start talking about it. And I think it's interesting. I think the first time I read Castiglione's book, I got myself all offended because he said that a woman should be very unlike a man in all these things. But as I read through it, I think that he's very shrewd in talking about the ways that a woman, especially in this time period, could leverage her position and her abilities to also be in a position of power, a position to gain power.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of that paragraph that Steph was reading, it says, and perhaps she would be worthy to be placed side by side with this great courtier, as well in qualities of the mind as in those of the body. And that's a very progressive thought, that he's not saying that it's just her beauty that is valuable, or even just her conversational skills, but this is mental training to be able to judge audience, to be able to speak correctly based on the audience, and this kind of good judgment that he talks about with the courtier. It's also central to the courtly lady, and it's also something that I hope that a college education helps to foster, is that kind of critical thinking, that judgment. So we talked a little bit about how she's both different and similar. He really emphasizes that a woman should act womanly and a man should act manly, whatever that means.
Women can't play drums, fifes, or trumpets.
Right, and they shouldn't dance with wild, jerky movements, apparently. But that the gracefulness that he requires of her is similar to the gracefulness that he requires of the courtier. So it's not so different in that way. Now, in contrast to this progressive view, we have this passage from Giovanni Michel Bruto's Education of a Young Noble Woman, and this is not a dialogue. This is more of a self-help book, I guess, for parents of young noble women to try to decide what kind of education they should have. Should they be educated like their brothers? Should the same tutors that come in and teach their brothers Latin and Greek and poetry teach the young women as well? Or as that kind of education, well, he claims, of course, that it's inappropriate.
And wasted on them. Well, it might make you virtueless.
Yes.
Is that a word?
It is now. I mean, I think it's interesting that in this passage, and this is the most often quoted passage from his much longer book, but in this passage he says that it is not meet, so not appropriate, nor convenient, and I interpret that to mean helpful, that it really doesn't do women any good, according to Bruto, to have this kind of humanist liberal arts education, because, first of all, the only reasons he could think of for it would be, one, to make money, profit, and women aren't supposed to be making money in this time period, at least not women of the noble classes, and then second, for recreation, and he worries that the kind of recreation that this kind of education would give the woman would, like you said, would corrupt her.
They're afraid that I'm trying to find the line here where basically he says that she would
The subtle and shameless
lovers.
Yeah.
Yes, subtle and shameless lovers, cunning and skillful writers, and something, blah, 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 blah. Okay, these are all, we've decided that these people are all poets.
Well, it's
Right.
interesting that he connects
Poetry.
poetry and loose women, and he was not the only one during this time to do that. That when a woman was sharing her education with other people, it was like sharing her body with other people, and that was considered to be a bad thing, just like we consider that in general in our society to be a bad thing.
Not the sharing of your poetry.
Yeah, exactly. But it's interesting that he sees those things going together, and this was not just Bruto. He is not an isolated case of people who were concerned that if a woman received the same amount of education as a man, not only would she become dissatisfied with her life, with her lot in life, with her assigned role of being the mistress of a, what does he talk about?
Household.
Of a household, yeah, the government of her household and family. She would be dissatisfied with that, but also that she would lose her morals.
Yeah, she would become morally corrupt.
Right.
That great hurt and damage would be done to them. And it's more convenient to be using the distaff and the spindle and the needle and the thimble if you want a good and honest reputation.
Right. And it's interesting that he even qualifies this last part, that writing verse is not a good thing if it's more about beautiful speech than about virtue. And hopefully by now in the semester, virtue is a very loaded word for you. But you could read this in the Platonic sense too, right? That he's afraid she'll get so caught up in the fun of writing and writing beautiful things that it won't be about being good anymore. And I don't know what he would have said about men's education, because we don't have a book that he wrote about that. But I don't know if there was a similar emphasis on being good. But there was certainly, I guess back in Castiglione, he said it's not just about speaking well, it's about saying things that are worthy of being said.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that emphasis but the word virtue doesn't really come up there. Okay, and then our last contrast here is the writing of Christine de Pisan. And Christine de Pisan is a century before these other two writers. So we're doing this a little bit out of chronological order. She's not theoretically, but technically she's in the late Middle Ages. She's not considered to be a Renaissance writer. Her book is about takes place a century before Castiglione's book. And again, it's a dialogue with her talking with reason.
Yes, and she's talking not with real people as in Castiglione, but she brought in the lady reason, lady rectitude, and lady liberty, lady justice, justice. So these are goddesses? Do I want to call them that?
You could call them that. That's what our head note calls them.
Yeah. So they're divine beings of some sort. We still see Lady Justice and Lady Liberty. We still see them as feminine embodiments. We have the Statue of Liberty. We have all the statues of Justice blindfolded, holding the scales. They are all women, and so it's a very interesting situation to set up to have a dialogue with. And I like the exploratory nature of it. It does seem much more Socratic to me.
Mm-hmm. Although she does set these goddesses up as spokespeople for God, right?
That's
that
true.
she's asking them what God thinks, and these women are able to speak for God. So I guess that's a sort of religious tradition as well, having these sort of intercessory figures that are often women, like the Virgin Mary or something, that can speak on behalf of God about what God thinks about stuff.
So God must trust them a lot.
Sounds like it.
Trust them to get it right. Okay, so we're going to the highest authority here.
Right. And
Okay.
I think it's interesting that this format allows Christine to just be the humble seeker of answers. She's not being like this strident feminist and saying, oh, women should do this and women should do this. She says, can you tell me why? Can you tell me whether this is a good idea?
So she's speaking gracefully and with sweetness and softness.
And appropriate to her audience without offending them.
Exactly, okay.
So she starts out in the section that we have, asking Lady Reason, please enlighten me again whether it has ever pleased this God who has bestowed so many favors on women to honor the feminine sex with the privilege of the virtue of high understanding and great learning, and whether women ever have a clever enough mind for this. I wish very much to know this because men maintain that the mind of women can only learn a little. And so I think it's interesting, she actually has two things going on. First of all, is it okay for women to be educated, and then can women handle it?
Yeah.
Is this, is it going to be too much for them?
Mm-hmm. And the answer is quickly, well, of course they can handle it. the opposite of those men's opinion is true. And then Lady Reason says, I will give you proof through examples. If it were customary to send daughters to schools like sons, and if they were taught the natural sciences, they would learn as thoroughly and understand the subtleties of all the arts and sciences as well as sons. So basically saying if the education is the same, women are as capable of learning things as men.
Yeah, and she goes even a little farther than that, though, to say that because women's bodies are more delicate and weak, then their minds are sharper and freer when they get the opportunity. So that there's a sort of nature, she's suggesting at least, that nature makes up for women's weaker bodies by giving them sharper minds.
Which is an interesting, because we see a tradition going even back to Plato saying that you must have sound bodies to be evidence of your sound mind.
Mm-hmm. Right, so she sets up a little contrast here. But certainly talks about women's lack of education in her time being a matter of custom, misguided custom, not a matter of biological inability. Right? There were certainly people during this time and during other times that thought that women were incapable of learning, that their brains would become overheated, that it would affect their ability to have children.
Yes, I remember. My great-grandmother, who was going to high school in the early part of the 20th century, was told at her high school women were not allowed to take physics. She enrolled anyway, but they were not allowed to take physics because that was bad for their body. You might not be able to have children.
And here you are.
So. I know. She did only have one child, and that child was prevented from taking physical education because 20 years later, with the next generation, well, they didn't want women's frail bodies out there hardening themselves because that might make it hard for them to have children. And yet, the species manages to persevere.
Somehow. Although, like Steph and I were talking before about how this gets really complicated, these issues about education and women having children, and the fact that the more educated women are, the fewer children that they tend to have, and whether that's a good thing or not. And we don't know.
It probably depends on which country you live in.
Certainly, and the circumstances under which you're living.
Absolutely. There's just not a clear, easy answer for anything, is there?
But like Plato says, I think that the opportunity to ask these questions and to deal with them, oh, sorry, my phone's ringing in the background, but to talk about these things is of value in itself.
Okay, and I guess while Jen is shutting off her answering machine, I'll talk a little bit more. What I think is fun is to look at the issues that we're addressing now. I mean, they're hundreds of years old, and they still provoke a lot of conversation, and there's issues that we still try to wrestle with. I mean, it's easy to come down and say, yes, absolutely, women and men should be educated exactly the same. Or it's easy to say, no, there's some really important differences, and this is what they are, and there should be some differences in the way people are educated in order to the way they should act in society. But the question that we keep going back to here in both the Renaissance and medieval readings we're reading for this week, and then also the week before in the Republic, are these questions of how society is supposed to function. And especially we're looking at the ruling levels of society. So these questions move beyond individual fulfillment and into your role as as a citizen in a larger society.
Yeah, and that's a really excellent point, partly for a bunch of reasons, but I think partly because when Bruto is talking about his reasons for a woman not to be educated, it's not about necessarily what will make her happy.
No.
It's about what's going to be good, right? Mm-hmm. What we want, how we want things to run, and that in his time women do not govern. They do not run society, so why would she learn about law and government? And then even the examples that Christine de Pisan gives here, I think it's interesting that they are, she really takes into account that they are women. For instance, the story about Hortensia and the fact that she uses her legal knowledge and her argumentative skills in order to fight for a law, or against a law that would harm women, or would, a tax on jewelry, that I think, oh, well, that's interesting that it becomes a feminine concern that she's fighting for. And then in the other story, that the woman has to be concerned about the effect of her beauty on the students and draw that veil behind them because maybe that would be distracting. Maybe it would make it harder for them to learn if they have this beautiful woman in front of them, a class full of young men, perhaps.
With no self-control, apparently.
Well, and that goes to this discussion we were having about, are the terms of the argument still the same in our day and age? Do we argue about what subjects boys and girls should be learning? Or do we argue about the methods? Because it does seem that there's been quite a bit of research that's come out lately that suggests that boys and girls do not learn the same.
Right.
and that the learning styles in classrooms often benefit girls more than boys. And so maybe we're having a similar discussion, but it's not about subject matter so much anymore, it's about methods.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose I should have something really smart to say right now, but I don't.
Well, that's the end of our thing. So you can think about it. So we don't have answers for you. We just have lots of questions, as usual. So have fun thinking about them.